I think tariffs are horrible things, unless you use them for negotiations, which is exactly what Trump did. And I actually predicted, I said, this is what's going to happen. China is going to come to the table because China has more to lose, because India is sitting there going, oh yeah, we want to do all the iPhones. We want to do this, we want to do that. China's like, oh my gosh, if we let India step in, if we let Vietnam step in, if we let Cambodia step in, we're going to lose all our money.
All right, Neil Mammen.
Nice to meet you.
Did I say it right?
Mammen, but that's
Mammen,
fine.
Mammen. Thank you for joining me in the den. In the den. I know we're in the tavern, but today it's the den. So it's a blessing that they allowed us to use. Rick Green allowed us to use his studio. So again, thank you for joining me. We've spent most of the day today together on the gun range.
Yep.
How'd you like that?
Oh, it was interesting. I own a gun, but can't say I know much about guns.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
You look like a natural out there.
Oh, I don't know. I had trouble with the magazine. I kept dropping the magazine.
Yeah. It's been even a fun weekend. You spoke at this conference that we were at, the Liberty Pastors. I really enjoyed it. We'll get to that in a little bit. But if you could just give us a little bit about your background. I know you have I think you were born in Ghana.
Yeah.
To Indian parents.
Yep.
Spent some time in Yemen, if I'm not mistaken.
Jamaica.
I'll let you tell
Yeah,
us.
so born in Ghana, lived in Jamaica, Sudan, Ethiopia, Yemen. My parents are Indian. And then came to the States when I was 18, got my bachelor's degree in electrical engineering, computer engineering, master's in solid-state physics and electrical engineering at the age of 22. So yeah, and then
At the age of 22.
I've been working in the industry, working in Silicon Valley since then.
Impressive.
Until recently, yeah.
Impressive. So in one of the information that I read on you, I don't know if it was the book, because I bought a book, a couple books actually.
Oh, you bought the other one too? Okay,
yes.
Yeah. So Jesus is involved in politics. Why aren't you?
Yes.
Why isn't your church? Yeah.
Yes.
Which one was the other?
The other one was about the children.
Yeah, Apologetics for Kids. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I'd like to get into that in just a little bit, but something I read was that you spoke Arabic.
Well, I used to speak. Yeah, I mentioned that I used to speak Arabic because growing up in Sudan and Yemen, I used to speak street Arabic. Just nothing. I couldn't read or anything, but I could cuss people out in Arabic.
Just the important stuff.
No, I didn't really cuss. I've actually probably never cussed, but it's always funny to say.
Yes, sir.
I could yell at people in Arabic. Yeah.
Yes, sir. So Arabic is not. It's not to be mistaken with what Jesus spoke, which was Aramaic.
Jesus spoke Aramaic.
Okay.
And the connection there, what's interesting about it, is Aramaic is what they spoke in Assyria. Not Syria, but Assyria. Assyria is Nineveh, right, where Jonah went. That was the Assyrians. Mm-hmm. So what happened is when the Jews, by the time the Jews, Israel got conquered by the Assyrians, but Judea got conquered by Babylonians. But by the time the Babylonians came, Assyrian had become like the lingua franca. Everybody spoke Assyrian. Mm-hmm. So even the Babylonians spoke Assyrian, or at least the people in Babylon spoke Assyrian. So when they came out of captivity, that Aramaic, Assyrian, continued. And so now if you go to a Assyrian church, because there's a strong Assyrian church, they speak Aramaic. So it's kind of, I actually preached at a friend's Assyrian church just in San Jose a few months ago, and they read the Bible in Aramaic. And it was kind of chilling because that's the language that Jesus spoke, right?
Yeah, it's kind of not widely spoken anymore, is it?
No, because the Assyrians lost their land to the Arabs pretty much, right?
So it's very few people that still speak that language.
Yeah, it's a small group community. Yeah.
Wow, that's interesting how a language can just disappear.
Yes. But here's the other thing: language just appeared too. It turns out there are no proto-languages. Whenever languages have appeared in the record of his civilization, they've appeared completely ready and intact. There are no partial proto-languages, I should say.
Really?
Yeah, all the language. In fact, this is in my book. I call I talk about the Big Bang, and I talk about all these things. I said there's a Big Bang of language, and the Big Bang of language is that language suddenly popped into existence. We don't know how or why. Well, we know how or why, but science and archaeology and history and anthropology has no existence of partial proto-languages.
Wow.
So.
I learned something new every day. That's very interesting. You know what I learned the other day, and tell me, you might know a lot about that subject, about the age of the Earth.
Okay, yeah.
So I saw something on the mitochondria mutation studies and the Y chromosome mutation studies, and how that testing or those trials or whatever they do with that shows the Earth, or at least humankind, only being about 6,000 years old.
I hadn't heard 6,000. I had heard it was under 100,000.
Right. So,
but if there's something new, maybe, yeah.
So what I read was that it's at 100,000 when they consider other things that is kind of, well, it should be like this should have happened, and this and that. But when they only go through that testing, it only gives 6,000.
Yeah, and it's quite probably. Now, here's what's interesting about that. When they did the testing of so there's two genes. There's a gene that women get from their mother, and there's a gene that men get through their father, right? Mm-hmm. So it's mitochondrial Eve is the mother of all the women, and the Y chromosome Adam is the father of all the men, right? Now, they just use the words Eve and Adam. But what was interesting about that, and the dating is that the years are not important, but what's important is the time gap. So when they work back to mitochondrial Eve, she is something like 100,000 years, or not 100,000, I think, depending on the number, something like 50,000 years older than Y chromosome Adam. So that means that there were women around for 50,000 years before men showed up, right? And this, you were like, well, obviously there's something else happened.
Right.
That doesn't make sense. But here's what, if you start looking at that carefully, here's what you realize what's happening. Is when they say there's mitochondrial Eve, it doesn't mean that women have only been around. All women only came from that woman Eve, the mitochondrial Eve. What it says is that at some point in mankind's history, all the other women died, and only this mitochondrial Eve was around. So all the other women with different mitochondrial DNA died, and so she was the necking event, right? So imagine if you had 10 people, there'd be 10 different types of mitochondrial Eve, but if 9 of them died, only 1 would continue forward. Make sense? Well, when they went to the Y chromosome Adam, they realized that that's the same case. There's an Adam, the oldest ancestor for all men is a single male, and he is 50,000, and I use the dates loosely. This is the numbers they use, and I'm just going to use their numbers. He is 50,000 years younger than the Eve, the oldest woman that we.
She's the cougar.
So here's where it gets very interesting. Imagine that there was a extinction event where every human being on the planet died except for 1 man and 4 women. Now all the men would then date their ancestry back to this 1 man. But the 4 women, their earliest ancestor would be long before that point, right? Because all 4 of them have different mitochondrial Eve. So their mitochondrial Eve would be earlier than that. So if you had an extinction event where all the men except for 1 man died, and all the women except for 4 women died, then the woman would look like she was older than the man. What happened on the ark? There was 1 man named Noah who had 3 sons who all start with him, but there were 4 women that were completely unrelated to anybody else. What the mitochondrial evidence shows is that there was a necking event where there were a few women who were not related directly to the men, and it kind of proves that there was some event like that.
Wow. That's amazing, because I think some of the study that I was reading on, it was post-flood.
Yeah.
So that's what they find, like when it comes to fossils
Yeah.
and DNA,
Yeah.
it's post-flood.
Now, here's one thing I would say, though. I'm an engineer, master's in solid-state physics and stuff like that.
Means you're pretty smart. Right?
It's funny that, I don't know that I am. I always say I would just happen to be interested in science because my dad was a professor in physics. That's why we traveled all over the world, because he was teaching at different universities. And I don't think that I'm smarter. I just took an interest in something that people think is a tougher subject, right? It's like my kids, they hated math because they thought it was too complex. But then we did homeschooling with something called teaching textbooks. This is an app for teaching textbooks. All my kids love math now, right? Because teaching textbooks was so good at math that homeschooling was perfect. But they did all the other math before, like the Saxon math and all that. They're like, yeah, I'm not a big fan of it. They got into teaching textbooks. They all love math, right? Mm-hmm. All three of them, right? So it really has to do with who you're interested in. Anyway, so I'm sitting here and I worked with all these different companies, and the average event is, being a believer and I teach apologetics, which is the defense of Christianity using science, logic, reason, philosophy, history, archaeology. Right? So I'm sitting at lunch with some engineer, and I want to prove to them that God exists. Now, if I start with saying the earth is only 6,000 years old, that's the end of the conversation. You lose them. I'm not going anywhere with it. I don't need them to believe the earth is only 6,000 years old, but I do need to believe in something that's more powerful that they accept, and that's the Big Bang Theory. They all accept the Big Bang Theory. Well, what does the Big Bang Theory says? The Big Bang Theory says everything started to exist at a singularity, right? All starts to exist only. Now, before the singularity, nothing exists. And how do we know nothing exists? Because if you look at the equations for the Big Bang, the equations that came out of the Big Bang, Einstein's equation of relativity, E = mc squared, you'll notice that there are three things in it: matter, time, and energy. Okay? If you turn any of these to zero, the equation blows up or becomes zero. So what we've figured out is you can't have matter without time, you can't have time without energy, you can't have energy without matter. All three came into being at the same time. So I'm talking to an atheist or a scientist, Hindu, Muslim, whatever. Well, Muslims are not a problem. They believe in God, but not our God necessarily, but they believe in a God. Okay, so but Hindus are all functional atheists. Most Hindus are functional atheists, right? Very interestingly enough, at least the scientific ones. So you're talking to them and you say, look, the Big Bang Theory, which you accept, says that matter, time, and energy all came into being at the same time. So, and that was the first time they ever existed. So whatever brought matter and time and energy into existence, and nothing can create nothing. Everything that begins to exist must have a cause, right? So anything that begins to exist must have a cause. Anything that existed forever needs no cause. And the reason anything that existed forever needs no cause is because if you have existed forever, nothing came before you. And so if nothing came before you, nothing could have caused you. So anything that begins to exist needs a cause. Anything that existed forever needs no cause. Well, matter, time, and energy began to exist. So what is the cause of matter, time, and energy? Well, what do we know about matter, time? Well, if matter, time, and energy began to exist, whatever created matter is not composed of matter. Whatever created time is not constrained by time. Whatever created energy does not need energy. Now, what have I just described? I've described something that's not material, supernatural, is outside of time, that makes it eternal, does not need energy, that makes it omnipotent, all-powerful. So I've just described a non-material, eternal, omnipotent creator of the universe. What have I just described to you? And most atheists will look at that and they go, well, you don't know it's God. I'm like, no, I don't know it's God, but you tell me what what meets those three characteristics: timeless, omnipotent, and eternal. And non-material. And most of them will be like, oh, I guess I never thought about it.
Right.
And suddenly you're in the conversation about an eternal God as a scientist. And notice, I have not used the Bible. I've used science to bring them to that point where they've got to deal with that issue.
So you kind of minister to them at a level that they can understand.
Not only they can understand, but they have trouble refuting because I've used facts, logic, reason.
Yeah, and I think everybody needs to be addressed in their arena and their level of understanding, or because for them, like you said, they have to understand something that cannot be refuted. Not everybody needs that.
No.
But some people do.
Well, I mean, I think the more learned, remember, the more learned you are, the more you need to bring that into what you are. Now, if you came to faith, or if you came to your lack of faith through intellectual, it's going to take, a lot of times, it's going to take intellectual thinking to bring you back. Mm-hmm. But if you came to a lack of faith or a different faith through blind faith, that means you got there through emotion. It's going to take emotions to bring you back. And that's why I believe, like if I have this conversation with a non-scientific Muslim, right? He's not going to agree with me because he has alternative explanations for everything. But his faith is based on an emotion. So the only way to reach him is going to be through visions or an emotional experience that matches it, which is why we see so many visions in the Middle East and in Muslim countries now, because God is reaching to them where they need to be reached at.
So yeah, somebody just recently mentioned that God was ministering to the Iranians through visions and dreams.
Yes, because they're Muslim, yeah.
That we didn't have a need to be going in there. And what I said was like, well, now they'll be free to hear the gospel.
Yeah, so let me tell you so when it came out that Muslims were having visions, I was like, okay, so what does that mean? We don't need to preach the gospel. And I think it does not mean we don't need to preach the gospel. So I talked to, he was Eritrean, so Ethiopian Muslim from out of Ethiopia. Used to be Eritrea and used to be North and South Ethiopia was one country when I lived there. And then they split. Now it's north is Eritrea, the south is Ethiopia. But the north is mainly Muslims. The Eritrean Somalians, although those are all Muslims, and Sudan is Muslim. So as you go up, it's all Muslim. When you go south, you get more Christians. So so I was talking to him. He's an Eritrean guy, and I met him at my father-in-law is a pastor. Mm-hmm. And I met him at his church, and I said, oh, so you're Eritrean? I said, that's unusual because most Eritreans are Muslim. He says, I used to be a Muslim. In fact, my name, and he gave me his Muslim name. And I said, oh, so how did you become a Christian? He said, I had a dream. I had a very emotional dream, and in the dream, Jesus talked to me and said, go meet this man in the marketplace. And so he went to the marketplace, and there was this Christian man there. And the Eritrean guy says, and I told the guy, I'm supposed to talk to you. And the guy was like, oh, you are? Okay, sure. And he said, what I'm after? He says, well, Jesus talked to me. And he said, you would teach me his words. So it wasn't that immediately he knew how to be a Christian. This other Christian had to still be there and actually give him the gospel. He just had I shouldn't say all, Jesus, that was a very powerful part, but Jesus opened his heart. Prepared his heart, opened his heart. And
it's almost like the woman that the scripture says that God prepared to provide for the prophet Elijah during the drought. So I prepared a widow there for you. So I agree. I believe that that's what God does. As soon as he told me that, because he was against the Trump's bombing of the nuclear sites. Yeah. I said, how can you be against him bombing nuclear sites? They didn't hurt nobody. And this will free up. I believe
they only hurt the people involved in the
right.
But the average innocent person was not anywhere
right
because it was a military installation.
And I said Iranian people have been crying for liberation, and he mentioned the dreams and visions. I was like, those dreams and visions could be sparking them or motivating them, initiating them to pray for something like this to happen in their country, so that they can be free to live out their faith. I think you can live out your faith in any condition, but even God brought back the captivity of
so this is what this I believe that all pastors should be involved politically. I believe politics is the realm of the pastor, and the difficulty here is that most people are going to say, no, I don't think they should be involved. It's got nothing to do with us. Yet in places like Iran, the pastors will say, but you see, in places like that, the church is growing because of persecution. And so they're almost like, if we had more persecution in America, then the church would grow because we got so many feeble Christians. I'm like, yeah, look, it sounds good, but it's not a direct correlation. And they're like, what do you mean? I said, look, let's go through the numbers. And you go through the numbers and you find that the church sometimes grows in persecution if the regime is not draconian. If the regime is draconian, the church shrinks. It does not grow through all persecution. And here's the thing. The church has never grown under Muslim persecution. It has only stabilized unless God has moved in their lives. So either supernaturally, but the church does not organically grow under Muslim persecution, because unlike like communist persecution, depends on who's in charge, it would go like this. Roman persecution, depending on which Caesar was in charge, it would go like this. And when the Caesar would back off, the church would grow. Communist persecution, when the state would back off, the church would grow. But whenever they clamped down on it, the church shrunk. Why? Because they were just killing everybody. And that's what what Islam was doing. They were just killing the Christians. So, and in my book I say, so in some countries there are no pastors over 25. Why? Because they're dead.
What is it about Islam? Because if you look at Iran, just probably in the 70s, you would think you were watching video from the United States. It was a prosperous country. Now it was fashionable. The same type of fashion that was here was over there. Now you look at them, and they're covered from head to toe. Women are covered from head to toe. There seems to be an oppression over.
So there's two parts of this. First of all, what you have to understand is that most of the Sharia law regimes. So I have a very dear friend who is Muslim, and he says Islam needs their reformation. And he said, what you don't understand, and what most people don't understand, is almost every Islamic regime today are communist regimes that are using Islam. Not that they believe in communism, but they understand the principles of communism. So they're really Marxists, Islamist Marxists, and that's what they're. So if you look at most of the Islamic regimes today versus most of the Islamic regimes like 50 years ago, completely different, right? Look at the Ataturk, and then you look at the current Erdogan, right? Completely with the Erdogan is like, man, we're going to crush all the other religions. We're going to be Sharia law. We're going to do all this. But you look at Ataturk, it was like, I'm going to have an open state. He was not communistically influenced as much as Erdogan is, or Khomeini or Khamenei was. Mm-hmm. They're not. That's a very communistic methodology of draconian control. Now, here's what we should understand. We are responsible for the Iranian people. We made this happen. So let's go back to the Shah of Iran. The Shah of Iran was put in by American oil companies. They had an election before the Shah of Iran, democratic elected, and he was a good guy. He was a Muslim, but he was not a fanatic. He was not a Marxist, nothing like that. He was going to take power, but here's what he was going to do. He was going to take all the oil companies, British Petroleum and all these guys, he was going to take it, and he was going to bring that oil money back to Iran and let Iran grow. Our companies did not want that. So they worked with the CIA to put the Shah in power. And he ruled with a dictatorial hand. So not Marxism, but fascism, right? Now, Marxism and fascism are really close to each other. Turns out it's the same doctrine, but fascism, where he was controlling them. So we put the Shah in power, and that's why when Khomeini came in the 80s, he was fighting a puppet government put in place by the American oil companies, and that's what led to happen. If we had never touched that situation, if we had said, look, it's their oil, let them do what they want with the oil, Iran would never have been in this situation. So we're responsible for that. The CIA is responsible for that.
Yeah.
Right?
The deep state, huh?
Yeah. So now Iran has a chance of getting its own elections, its own power. But we have to make sure that whoever gets in power is not a puppet, because then it'll just repeat again. I mean, you know why we call it a banana republic, right? Because the United Fruit Company, when Nicaragua had a free election, this is back in the 30s, right? Nicaragua has a free election. They elect a guy, and he says, I'm not going to have the United Fruit Company grow bananas anymore. I'm going to get rid of them. So what happens is the United Fruit Company goes to Teddy Roosevelt, who sends the Marines there, right? And then later on, Woodrow Wilson does that. Why do you call it a banana republic? Because we put our banana puppet in there so our American companies could take control. Again, CIA, whatever, whoever's in power. I don't know if the CIA was doing it back then, but it was an American interest, right? So this is the problem. We've done this to these countries. So that's why they hate us. Now, that does not mean that we should now back away and say, well, we're going to roll over. We should now do our best to allow them to have their own independent elections. The question is, will they?
Do you think Trump's trying to do that?
Trump is a Trump, let's put it this way. After what Bush did in Bush 1, I was a George W. Bush fan all the way until we found no weapons of mass destruction. I said, well, this is a big lie, right? So I don't trust Bush. I trusted Reagan to some extent, but I believe Donald Trump he's the real deal. He's like, no, this is not our fight. We can assist you to get there, but we're not going to be the guy. We're not going to control you. We're not going to put it.
What do you think he is talking to Iran about to have them come to the table? I mean, other than us bombing their nuclear facilities, they're still not the type that would come to the table to talk peace, not with Israel. What do you think is happening behind the scenes that Donald Trump is able to get them to the table?
Well, I don't know that. I'm hoping he will. He says he's going to, and I pray that he is. Look, I grew up in the Middle East, right? They only understand power, right? Whenever we go and we say, oh, can we be nice to you? They're like, this is weakness, we don't respect. You come to them with power, they respect power. Their whole history of one is power. I mean, the whole caliphate thing. Who got control of Islam? Whoever killed the other guy, right? The whole history of the caliphates is one caliph killing another caliph who was killing another caliph and whoever. So it's a history of power, right? It's not like the church, right? It's more like the Vatican than it's like the church, right? It's not what we call the church because there was no. That's why in fact some people don't like denominations. Denominations are one reason why the truth can continue, because if your denomination goes south, there's another denomination or non-denomination you can join. The truth is still out there. There's no big global control, right? Look what happened to Catholicism when the last pope was in power. I mean, it was just, I don't know enough about the new pope, but it was horrible. Like, he was a socialist right out of liberation theology, which I know a lot about. And I mentioned it briefly in the book. My father was a communist and a Marxist. My uncles were all communist and Marxists. In fact, my uncle was one of the speakers of the World Council of Churches, which is a big liberation theology Marxist organization, right? So I grew up in that environment. So I understand a lot of that. I understand the motivations. I understand their appeal to Francis was liberation theology Marxist out of South America, right? So. So Iran. Sorry, coming back to Islam, kind of went off topic there. But coming back to Islam, Islam is a history of power. Whoever's in power makes the rules, and so they understand power. So if you negotiate from a position of power, they're willing to negotiate. Why is Iran willing to negotiate? Because they know that we will take them out. If Biden was there, they were like, "Yeah, you can talk. We know you'll never do anything." But with Trump, they're like, oh, this guy's a wild card. In fact, the best thing you can do to negotiate with these people is be unpredictable.
And they respect that.
Yeah, because they have no idea what you're going to do. You've shown that you are willing to do things. I mean, think about this. Obama said ISIS was the biggest problem for years, right? Well, what can we do about ISIS? Trump comes in power. Nobody's heard about ISIS. 3 months into it, we never hear about ISIS again. They're gone completely. Why? Because Trump's like, I'm not fooling around with these guys. We're going to take them out. They're taking them out. ISIS is gone. And yet ISIS was responsible for killing thousands and thousands of the Kurds, thousands of the Yazidis, or I can't remember the name, and then thousands and thousands of Christians. Just killing them. Trump comes in. When was the last time you heard ISIS?
Yeah. And then he also said North Korea was a big problem. And Trump goes over there and steps on North Korean ground and shakes his hand.
Yeah. And
they ain't got nothing to say.
Yeah, I mean.
And then they talk about the border.
But you have to also understand, how did Trump get Saudi Arabia and Qatar and Kuwait to all do the Abrahamic Accords? He says, look, you guys are in trouble, right? You need trade agreements. You need to be more stable. Saudi Arabia is a kingdom, right? That kingdom is afraid of falling any minute, right? Mm-hmm. Now, you could argue, did we prop Saudi Arabia up? Did the Arab American Corporation oil company prop them up? You could go into all that history, because there's the House of Saud, there was another house before them. Did we pick and choose the winners or losers? I'm not sure about the history. It's kind of vague. It's not as clear as Iran's history. But they know that, Osama bin Laden's gripe against America was that we were upholding the House of Saud. That was one of his. There were other things. He also hated the fact that women were allowed to wear pants and work in stores and all. That was if you go down it, right? And he said, you guys allow homosexuality and all that. It's one of the reasons why he claims to have done 9/11. But the reason the Saudis and all that came to the Abrahamic Accord is because they needed more stability and they needed more trade. And so trade is the money, is the currency of the era. Why does China come to the table? I wrote a whole article. If you go to my, it's Substack/Mammen, Mammen, Substack.com/Mammen. I wrote a whole thing on tariffs, right? Being more of a minarchist, minimum government kind of guy, I think tariffs are horrible things unless you use them for negotiations, which is exactly what Trump did. And I actually predicted. I said, this is what's going to happen. China is going to come to the table because China has more to lose, because India is sitting there going, oh yeah, we want to do all the iPhones. We want to do this. We want to do that. China's like, oh my gosh, if we let India step in, if we let Vietnam step in, if we let Cambodia step in, we're going to lose all our money. The rand is going to be useless, right? So of course they're going to come to the negotiation table. America's got the biggest hammer, both in terms of trade and the biggest hammer. I mean, you go to Saudi Arabia, so look, you're not going to get any planes from us. You're not going to get any business from us. You better come to the Abrahamic Accords because business is important. Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, maybe we'll show up. Mm-hmm. So Kim Il-jong, I don't know. Now, okay, so I'm going off topic here, but here's what's interesting about Kim Il-jong. The guy's an idiot, right? He sits there in power, and his people are starving. What most people don't realize is if Kim Il-jong would open up his economy the same way as South Korea has opened up his economy, he would be 10 times richer today. Now, does he need more money? No, but he would be 10 times richer, and he wouldn't have to give up any power if he just let it. I mean, he's still a dictator, just like China, like Xi is a dictator. The only difference is, what did China do? China said, oh, this stupid communist economy is not going to work. Well, let's go to a capitalist economy. So what is China? China's not a communist country anymore. They're a capitalist dictatorship, right? So Kim Il-jong just said, hey, I'm going to let my people have free enterprise. I'm going to let them do their business. I'll still be the top dog, which is bad, but all his people would stop suffering. He would be 10 times richer, and everybody would be better off.
So why is he rich?
Because when you have a few million people slaving, he's not rich in the sense he has everything he needs, right? He has servants, he has food, because any farming goes to him. So he's rich in the sense of he has stuff to take care of. He does what he wants when he wants, right?
You got to maintain that somewhat, and people who aren't getting anything in return they're getting not force, to die. Yeah, is force Sadly. And a heavy hand the only incentive and motivation they have?
That's
to do
pretty much it. Yeah.
That's
I mean,
tough.
Think about it. When his father died, you saw people out there crying, and it was all fake crying. You could tell it was fake crying. But why were they there? Because if they weren't there, they would have been killed the next day, right?
I don't understand how somebody gains that much power.
Oh, it's not power. It's fear. It's terrorism, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, when power, it's fear. It's terrorism. It's like if tomorrow some gang took over this area, right? And you're like, this is the only way to survive is to kowtow to them. Now, most Americans would say, not doing it. I'm going to fight you back because we have guns. Right. But if you don't have a gun, they have the guns, you just have a stick. Nothing you can do.
That's what confounds me about Cuba. I don't understand how a people wouldn't rise up against a dictatorship like that.
Well, because they don't have any ammo. They don't have guns. They don't have ammo. They're barely. So, have you ever been to Auschwitz or any of these camps in Germany?
No, I have not.
You should go. I mean, it's a horrible place, and it's a very moving experience. But you ask yourself, how could, say, 10,000 people be managed by 200 guards? Why wouldn't they just break out of it? Mm-hmm. Well, here's how they did it. So if you go into Auschwitz or any of these places, you'll see how these prisoners come in, and they're all healthy and strong, and they're taken care of. But then slowly the food starts going out, and the food gets less and less. And then you see the pictures of them, they're starving to death. Why were they starving to death? Not because the Germans didn't have enough food. How does a starving group of people have any energy to fight back? They can barely move. They can barely they can barely lift their own weight. How are they going to overthrow a German guard? Even if 10 of them or 100 of them were able to coordinate that and not care about their lives. It's a whole mental, physical thing.
So you understand that, and you understand the dangers of socialism, communism. Mm-hmm. Cubans, Hispanic people on the norm, Mexican descent, they tend to vote Democrat.
Yeah.
Because of the mentality that was set in them growing up. Their parents told them, you're Hispanic, you got to vote Democrat because they're for the poor. Yeah. So when Hispanics see anybody that doesn't vote Democrat, they call them sellouts and that kind of stuff. Then they see Hispanics like Cubans, and they want to call them sellouts as well. Cubans do not vote Democrat.
Never.
Because they're coming from Cuba. They understand communism and socialism. They know politics and government extremely well.
Very active, yeah.
Yeah, your common Cuban on the street can tell you a whole bunch of history about
Florida's full of them, right?
Fidel Castro and all that.
Yeah.
And the Hispanic, the Mexican American culture cannot comprehend that. They don't understand that because they're so, what's the word? They're ignorant, and by that I just mean they don't have knowledge about politics and anything other than their parents, their fathers and grandfathers telling them you're supposed to vote this way, and that's tradition and culture has got them voting. In that
and
way.
So this is a cultural. It's the same with the blacks. You know, we vote Democrat. Why? Well, because we always vote Democrat. Well, they're not the ones who freed us from slavery.
Right.
Yeah, but and then the excuses, there's always an excuse. Well, you know, the Democrat and the Republican Party flipped. No, that's not. Turns out that's not true at all. Mm-hmm. Turns out that there was one person on the Republican Party, the Democrat Party, that moved to Republican. That was one. Mm-hmm. His name was Storm Thurmond, right? Mm-hmm. Everybody else stayed on their side. They didn't change. So this is all nonsense that they give this big story of, right? But I'll tell you why the blacks started voting Democrat. Two things. One, after the Civil War, there was a president who was not really a Republican. I think must be 16 years later or something. I can't remember. I have it in my book, How to Stop Racism in America. You can look it up, Neil Mammen on Amazon, How to Stop Racism in America. And in that book, I document there was and the guy's name, but he was a president. He was a Republican president, and the only way he was going to lose the primaries, but he got a bunch of Democrats to switch over and vote for him in the primaries, and there was a bunch of there was a big confusion that was going on because the electoral count was wrong, and they were going to have to do a recount, and so there was a bunch of things going on at the time. And he went to the Democrats and he says, look, you get me in power, I will pull all the Union troops out of the South. Why were the Union troops in the South? The Union were in the South to stop the Democrats from killing the blacks. Right? They pulled out of the South, and suddenly you had lynching, you had Jim Crow, you had all the stuff that was not there when the Republican Union troops were in the South. So the blacks were like betrayed by the Republican Party. It was just betrayed by that group of people, that one person and his cronies. But the Republican Party was like, no, this is a bad thing. We got to fight him. And they were fighting and trying to stop. They couldn't. Right. So this is one of the things. Then years later, we get FDR. By the time of FDR, almost 75% of blacks were voting for FDR. Why? Because he was promising them free stuff, right? Yeah, and so that's what happens. And then when you get to LBJ, he was the one who destroyed the black family. So at least FDR was giving everybody equally. LBJ sends 100,000 social workers into the black community and says, if you get rid of that man in your house, we will give you more money. The blacks used to get married at a higher rate. The marriage rate amongst blacks was higher than the marriage rate among whites in the middle of racism in 1930, right? Fast forward to 1968, there's still, most black kids are born in a family, with a two-parent home. 68, you start seeing that drop off. Why? Because LBJ's, Lyndon Johnson's social workers are going in and giving them money to get rid of the husband. I mean, that's not what they said. They would say, look, they would go in social work. In fact, I in the book I document two ladies who I interviewed, and they said, I remember I was a teenager at the time. She's about 60 now, so she was a teenager at the time. She says, and I remember the social worker coming to our house and arguing with my mom, saying, look, he's lost his job. Why don't you just kick him out of the house? I can get you twice as much money for the kids. Right? And another lady said that her mom would get really mad because she would get phone calls saying, hi, I'm coming over in an hour. Hide his keys and his jacket and his shoes, and I can say there's no man in the house and get you more money. And so it was in 1930, at the height of racism, with Jim Crow laws and everything, the fatherlessness rate in black families was 24%. Today, it's 74%.
Wow.
So, go back to the Hispanic families. What is the common fact? That we're promising you free money, free this, free that, free that. What are you going to do? You're going to start voting that way. Guess what? It's going to destroy the Hispanic family. Most Mexicans are pro-life because of the Catholic Church. Mm-hmm. Yet they're voting for a group that is happy not only to kill babies before they're born, they're willing to kill them after they're born. Right? The New York governor and all these, sometimes the baby will born and the mother can then decide if she wants to keep the baby. Now, is this any sort of Catholic, any sort of Mexican principles? No, I mean, nobody, no upstanding Mexican would ever go along with this. But because of the money, they care about us more. Yeah, they care about you more, but they want to kill your babies. I don't know how caring that is, right?
Mm-hmm. Whatever they give to, whatever they... what's the word? Whatever they praise, if you will, or reward, it just increases.
Yeah.
And I think that's...
Whatever you reinforce,
Yeah, whatever they reinforce. So I've seen that in the Hispanic community. I've said this before, where we live. There was this one time we went and go give out turkeys with our church, and it was in a government project home, and sat out there, and somebody comes up to us and asks for their turkey. And I said, well, we're not giving it out till 2:00. I said, well, I need my turkey now because I'm getting ready to go to Corpus, which is a town close by us. And I'm like, wow. I said, well, we're not giving it out till 2:00. So that mindset, and then I sit down with one of the ladies there, and she tells me how she's been there 20 years. In the government assistant housing, she's been there 20 years, and her grown son is getting ready to come back to live with her. And I'm like, how is that happening? Like, there's some people that really need that. They really need a home to be able to use it just to get back on their feet. I'm not against that. But if there's no checks and balances or oversight on that, it gets abused. And if people who are in that condition, well, you don't have a husband, it gets rewarded, and that behavior gets reinforced.
So if you look at the Bible, charity is never the function of the government, right? And if you remember my talk, I said you have to make a difference between rights and goods. Rights are something God gives you, like the freedom of speech, freedom to carry a gun, freedom to own guns, freedom of religion, right? Goods and services are the product of somebody's labor. So goods and services, that means somebody has to labor to get that. So if you look at education is a service, right? And there's goods involved with books and whatever. So if you say that education is a right, where are you going to get that education from? Are you going to go out and capture a bunch of teachers, beat them until they give you an education? No, because you've got to enslave somebody. Well, we can't do that. So what we do is we enslave everybody, take 30% of their income, and then use that. So we're enslaving people 30% of the time to take that money to give goods and services to other people. So the Bible says very clearly, goods and services are for charity. And here's the difference between charity. Charity is much more effective than government services. For every dollar that the government takes from you, less than 15 cents will get to the poor person. But for every dollar you give to charity, at least 85 cents will go to the poor person. Charities are 6 times more efficient. Secondly, a charity values itself. If I give you something and you are now self-sufficient, a charity says that's a success, right? A good charity. There are bad charities, but you can look at them and say, that's a bad charity, I'm going to give money. Because they're like, oh, now we have twice as many people. You're like, well, you're not doing your job, right?
Right.
The government, on the other hand, if they see one person on Social Security, or not Social Security, on welfare, and they get 5 others, they are more successful in the government side because we found more people to serve. Mm-hmm. And they get rewarded, and they get pensions, and they get all that. But guess what? Of that dollar that you're paying them, it's going to their expenses, it's going to their pension plan, it's going to their education, it's going to their junkets, their trips, their conferences, it's going to the, it's like there's a great politician in California, one of the few conservatives in California, and he said, if tomorrow I shut down all the schools in California, and I took all the money we're putting for kids in California, and I rented buildings, right? And just let them use nice, wonderful office space with triple net, so not triple net, with full services, janitor, everything like that. And then I bought them all club memberships at the latest gym. They would get all their PE, they would get all their swimming, they would get all the thing, and I'd have almost $8,000 left at the end of the year. And I would also hire only professors to teach these students instead of giving professors from Stanford. Gave them the same salary. I still end up with $8,000 a student. For that, we'll take $400,000 of that, send them to Europe for a real tour of all the old sites and all that every year. And they go to a different country everywhere. And he said, I still end up with $3,000 extra. Why? Because when you buy a school, only a union person can build that school, and that union person has to pay this certain amount, this, that, and the other. But if you were just to just hire a building that was just as good as that school, a business building that Cisco goes that rents, or somebody like that rents, you find it's a quarter of the price. Government is just horrible at these things. So why are we putting government in the business of charity when Christian charities? In the longer version of the talk I did, I didn't cover this. I do another talk. You can find online if you just look up Neil, Jesus is involved in politics, or Kansas politics at Jesus is involved in politics, or something like that. You can find it there. Yeah. But I said, if you give, once you give that dollar, right, to a charity, they will take care of you. So somebody came up to me right after I had said that, and I said, well, are you saying that your charities can take care of all the poor? I said, I think it's possible. They laughed at me. They said, we spend $1.2 trillion on welfare in all that's all the food stamps, that's the healthcare, it's $1.2 trillion. Do you think your church can do that? I said, yeah, I think so. They said, and they laughed, and they said, why? I said, well, because if my calculations are correct, instead of spending $1.2 trillion, I can spend 1/6 of that. I can spend $200 billion and replace all that with $200 billion, right? Or whatever, 1/6, yeah. And they looked at me and they're like, yeah, you think your church is going to raise $200 billion? I said, yeah, absolutely. They said, how? I said, because last year the church and conservatives gave $470 billion to charity. If we got the government out of the business, we just have to do another 50% of that. And the way you get there is you give everybody for every dollar they donate to a charity that takes care of the poor, they get $2 of tax write-off. You get that extra money overnight. But the government has to get out of the business. And the church has to take its place doing that. The church took its place back, then we wouldn't have this. And guess what? If you go to a church, and you've been living in assisted housing for 20 years for the church is paying for, the church is going to check up on you.
Yeah.
They're going to say, you don't even need that. And guess what? They're not going to just give you housing. They're going to give you counseling. They're going to give you help with your resume. They're going to help you every single way they can. They're not just going to give you money. They're going to take care of the whole person.
Right.
And it'll cost the country less money because that $1.2 trillion is 30% of our budget.
Yeah. Yeah.
We can give everybody a 30% tax break.
Yeah. Yeah, when we used to give the public food, whoever came in. So I started giving them word before we gave them the food.
Yeah.
So at first,
that's exactly what Jesus did. How surprising!
It was
first
a lot
preach,
of people.
Then feed.
Yeah, we buy the food from the food bank, Corpus Christi Food Bank, and at times they would give us grants.
Yeah.
Because what we were distributing, but you'd come in at first and there was large crowds, and it was like, wow, look at how many people we're serving. But it started dwindling. I said, this is not a bad thing.
Yeah.
I said, you don't want to have to be continuously serving the same people, especially if you're giving them word, preaching to them. They should be growing to the point that eventually they say, hey, I no longer need it.
Yeah.
And that should almost disappear, hopefully, at least go down in numbers. So I think when the church does it, they're motivated to see them get off of the assistance. When the government does it, they're motivated having them on assistance, not just because they get to solicit more money to give them and to put in their pockets, in their own pockets, but also you've got a constituent for life if they're dependent on you.
Yeah, and they're going to vote for you and they're going to put you back in power. It's this whole back. And worse than that is you're not helping them. Two, there's so much fraud. Remember this whole thing with Elon Musk, right?
Mm.
There are people who are on welfare who, shouldn't be on welfare. There are people who are on, getting funds and grants that they shouldn't be getting funds and grants. Because the government doesn't really care what you do with the money. It's not their money. The church says, this is our donors' money. We care about it if it's a good church.
It's God's
there
money.
are bad churches, right? There are bad churches, no crime. But those guys, once they're exposed, they stop giving.
Right.
You try stop giving to the IRS, they'll take care of you for a long time in jail. Right? Yeah. So it's a completely different beast, and God never meant for the government to take care of the poor. The government was supposed to protect you, just like in the Declaration of Independence. The only purpose of government is to secure the rights that God has already given you. That means to protect you from bad people within the country and without the country.
Mm. Yeah, which we've been learning about this whole week.
Yeah,
and you brought a tremendous word or teaching concerning apologetics. What are some of the biggest topics, if you will, or issues where apologetics comes in?
So I want to differentiate. There's two things. So apologetics is proving Christianity is true using science, logic, history, and philosophy. There's another aspect of apologetics that is sort of apologetic because it explains things. The word apologetics comes from, it does not mean to apologize. It comes from 1 Peter 3:15, which says, always be willing to give a person a reason for your faith, and that is the apologia for your faith. And that word apologia means to explain or argue, right? But always do it with gentleness and respect. Now, here's what we always forget. It doesn't say sometimes be ready. It doesn't say if you feel like it should be ready. It doesn't say if you're sharp, be ready. It doesn't say if you're a genius, be ready. It doesn't say if you have a degree in physics, be ready. It says always be ready. That means every single person should know apologetics and be ready to defend their faith using facts, logic, reason, right? Now, you can give a witness for you, but that's not apologetics. If you say, I became a Christian because of this emotional experience, that's not apologetics. So everybody should be able to give apologetics. Now, does everybody need apologetics? No. But everybody should be willing. That's a commandment from Peter, right? Which is the commandment from our Lord. So here's the biggest problem. I can talk atheists into believing that God exists. I do a whole series of classes. You can go to my YouTube site. It's X Blind Faith, right?
X Blind Faith.
So No Blind Faith is my ministry. X Blind Faith, because No Blind Faith always took you to some band in YouTube. So it was X Blind Faith, and I have a whole series. First I proved that a blind faith is bad, and I used the Bible to show that. And I go through all the different religions and compare them. And then I showed that God exists using science. I used the Big Bang Theory. I said, look, here's the Big Bang Theory. And I prove that God exists without using the Bible. Why don't I use the Bible to prove God exists? Some apologists use what they call they use apologetics in a way that they use the Bible to, and that works for some people. But my crowd, the scientists, if I quote the Bible, they're not interested.
You lose them.
I lose them. So I got to use. Sometimes apologists use what we call presuppositional apologetics, which is very powerful in certain circumstances. And what it says is like, you already know this. You know that that you're a bad person because you've done bad things. And it's a very powerful way. But if you use it on some of my guys, they're like, no, I'm not bad.
Right.
Have you ever lied? Yeah, but it's not important. I'm like, what? and so it doesn't work with my guys because they're ornery, they're smart Alex, and they think they're smart. And they are smart. So I can't use that. So I got to prove the Bible, God exists without using the Bible. And the Big Bang Theory I just showed you a few minutes ago. So then I proved that if God exists, right, what kind of God is he? Is he the God of Islam? He's not a pantheistic God. He can't be the Hindu God because there's 3 million Hindu gods. And you can't have more than one all-powerful being. So that goes out the door, right? So you throw atheism goes out the door, pantheism goes out the door. So what you're left with is Islam, Christianity, Judaism, or unknown God. The God we don't know yet. Well, so I say, let's look at Islam and Christianity and Judaism, right? And because if we can prove that it is the God of Christianity and Judaism, then the unknown God goes away and Islam goes away. So then I say, okay, let's look at the Bible. Let's see the Bible, which both Christianity and Judaism, Old Testament, Christianity, New Testament. Let's see if that's accurate. So we prove that the Bible is what was written 2,000 years ago. So then can I prove, using all that, can I prove that Jesus really rose from the dead? So that's the next one, is proving Jesus really lived. He was a real human being. He really lived, he died, and he really rose from the dead. It turns out you can do that using science and logic. Lee Strobel wrote The Case for Christ. That's a great argument, but I use most of my arguments from Josh McDowell's More Than a Carpenter, right? Great stuff there. And I've added a lot more evidence to it too in the years since then. So if Jesus Christ really existed, so you get to all through that, right? And now, if you're an atheist or a non-Christian, you're like, okay, I intellectually understand that, but I don't buy it. Why don't you buy it? Because, and this is the most important argument that every non-Christian has, how can God exist when there's so much evil in the world? And so I go through that and I explain that God has to allow you to do evil. Because if he doesn't allow you to do evil, you can't love someone unless you're free to not love them. You can't be a Christ follower unless you're free to be not a Christ follower. Now, I'm not talking about Calvinism and Arminianism, right? God opens up our eyes to see it. But you have the ability to sin. So God has to allow people to sin. Now, whether he then enables some people not to sin, he has to allow some people to sin. Right? And Paul talks about that. Even if you're a Calvinist, Paul talks about that. Why does God allow the vessels of wrath to be created? Well, so that his objects of mercy can understand them, right? So it doesn't matter where you stand on Calvinism or free will or whatever it is. It still all plays into it. God has to allow bad people to exist because he has to give them the opportunity to not love him. Otherwise, it's not love. So now you realize why bad things. Well, then why can't God stop bad things from happening? Because if he stops bad things from happening, then you never had the opportunity to do bad things. Like if every time you wanted to kill somebody, God stopped you from killing one, then you don't have the freedom to kill them, did you? Right? So he has to actually let you do bad things, and those bad things have to have consequences. If you then, every time you killed somebody, you raise them back from the dead, then you didn't really have the ability to kill them. You have to be able to do bad things, and the bad things have to be able to hurt people and be painful. And that's why God tells you not to do them. So that's why bad things happen to people, because God has to logically, and God is a logical God, he has to logically allow it to happen. And once they understand that, then they go, okay, well, my argument that how can God exist when there's so much evil in the world falls apart. And I go through a whole reason. It turns out it's a stupid argument, because if you say there is no God, then there's no standard of good and evil. So how can you call something evil if there's nothing to give you the standard of good and evil? And I walk through all that. So it really is it's a suicide statement, right? We talked about it. Suicide statement is a statement that kills itself the minute you say it. Like if you say there's no truth, you go, is that true? Right? Or in my example, I says it's wrong to force your moral values on other people, right? The example that the engineer gave me. And you go, wait, if it's wrong to force your moral values on other people, isn't that your moral value? Yes, and why are you forcing that moral value on me, right? Yeah. So obviously it's not wrong to force moral values on other people. You have to do it, right? And whose moral values do you force is the question. So once you get through all that, then they realize, okay, evil exists. Then I go to the next step. I said, well, here's the difference, though. God knew that he had to give you the ability to hurt people and harm people. God knew that you would suffer as a result of that. But he didn't leave you to suffer alone. He came to earth. He suffered with you and for you. And that's the difference. And then once he suffered with you, he's with you to the end of the age. And then when you die, this is only the first part of the story. More of the story is coming after you rise from the dead. Mm. And it only makes sense. Life has only meaning if there's an eternity.
Mm-hmm. Amen. And a lot of people have a hard time sometimes understanding that. So I love that you are finding ways to deliver that message and the creativity that God gives to be able to allow them to see, or what John 1:14 says, and the word became flesh and dwelt amongst us. Yeah. The word has to become flesh to each person, and it's different for everybody.
Yeah.
So I love that that's your ministry and that's what you dedicate yourself to. I think that's amazing. And I loved watching some of the examples that you were giving, because I think it's only the Spirit of God that reveals to us how to do those things.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Mm-hmm. And also you get, it's, and he puts you in those situations where you learn these things. Sometimes it's to your own pain. Sometimes, because somebody came up to me once and they said, they started arguing with me on evolution or something. Evolution is nonsense. I mean, every day we find more evidence that evolution is nonsense, right? So this guy's arguing with me about evolution. Now, I don't like arguing about evolution because I'm like, look, I don't care about evolution, right? I want you to know that God exists, and evolution doesn't disprove God. God could have used evolution. I don't think he did. I think the Bible's very clear. He didn't use evolution to do anything, right? It just looks like that because of the flood, right? Mm-hmm. So I start switching the conversation into proving God exists, right? And as an engineer, he's not a Christian, but he's heard. He's like, he says, this is really unfair. And he tells the guy, this is really unfair. And the guy thinks it's unfair because he's attacking. He goes, no, you don't understand. You don't have a chance in this conversation because Neil has talked to people like you for the last 30 years. He knows what you're going to tell him. He knows what you're going to say next. And it's not because I'm smart. It's because that's exactly, God has brought all these conversations in. So I pretty much know what the engineer is going to go next. What I don't know is what will resonate with them because everyone's different. Mm-hmm. So I know what the next question is. I know what the next, I know where it's going to lead because I've talked to so many people like that. But until I know them personally, I have no idea which of these things will actually resonate. Yeah. And so that's where you got to develop a friendship. You got to develop a respect. Right, so you always got to be gentle. Yeah.
If you can't do it at first, because sometimes it's easy just to share the gospel, but if you can't at first, you don't give up. You continue to find ways. I love watching people creatively, or not even just creatively. Sometimes it's just through who they are and the gifts that God has given them. Like for instance, I've used this before. Joe Rogan. I watched one of his episodes where Jordan Peterson is on there. Mm-hmm. I don't even know if he's a Christian. But
no,
he sure sounds like one.
Jordan Peterson is such a great intellectual, mm-hmm. and I think his daughter's a Christian, evangelical Christian.
Yes,
and I think his wife might be too. I'm not sure, but he's at that point where his great intellect is fighting him.
Right.
Because he's like, he knows it. He knows the truth.
It's
right?
like it's coming together.
Yeah.
And he cannot fight it.
Yeah.
He's sharing these stories, different stories on Joe Rogan's podcast, and he's just leaving Joe Rogan, breathless, speechless. And he's like, wow. Joe Rogan's like, wow. And he's using all these stories, and he's using Jesus and his sacrifice and how we're supposed to sacrifice for others and all that. And he's just blowing them away. And I'm just listening to it and watching it. And I'm like, wow, look at how God is using this man to minister to this one.
Probably not a Christian at all yet.
And then sometime back, I watch God use Kid Rock.
Yeah.
Who says he's a Christian, but I don't know.
Yeah, who knows, right?
Yeah. And he's talking to him. He says, asked him who he would go back and meet with if he had the chance. And he's like, Jesus. I was like, you go meet? Yeah, I'd like to go see Jesus. I meet with Jesus. And the conversation starts like, you believe in Jesus? Yeah, man. And how do you know? He said, I know. I just know.
Yeah.
So he tells him, you want to meet Jesus? Like, yeah, it almost seems like Joe Rogan is breaking down. Yeah. And Kid Rock is ministering Jesus to him. So it's just amazing to see how God uses different personalities, different giftings and characteristics. And with you, you're very intelligent. You're an engineer. We talked about how you were instrumental, or you designed the Dolby.
I was the chief architect, or the main architect for the hardware for Dolby Vision. So if you buy a TV that says Dolby Vision, I'm the guy who designed the hardware aspect of that, and we've got a bunch of patents and stuff on it. So I used to work for Dolby for 10 years.
So he uses someone with your gifting to reach people that I perhaps would never be able to reach. Because I don't understand what mindset would be used to create something like Dolby Vision.
Exactly, yeah.
You do. And you're able to maneuver around those types of mentalities and personalities and people.
Yeah, because it's very similar to mine. Right. It's this analytical, just a facts ma'am, right? Not
Correct.
Overly emotional.
Correct.
Yeah, but yet when I run into somebody who is emotional or who is not as analytical, they're like, what are you talking about, man?
Yeah. Yeah, so it's different giftings and talents.
God's going to use everyone in a different way.
Personalities, and I love watching it. I love watching other people minister to perhaps somebody you may not be able to minister to. So I think it's just a beautiful thing. And
and that's the beauty. God is willing to meet you where you are.
I think God... Go ahead.
The question is, are you willing to give it up? Because I've talked to atheists. In fact, my book, Who is Agent X? Proving God Exists Without Using the Bible, right, was edited by the engineer in the cubicle across from me. And, he's an atheist. And I was writing the book. And he says, what are you writing on? I said, I'm writing this book on Proving God Exists. He goes, I'd love to read it. I'm like, sure, okay. So I give it to him. He reads it, and he edits it. He says, this is a bad argument. And he goes through the whole thing. I mean, great input, right? So the book is almost ready to publish. And I said, hey, can I thank you for editing it? He goes, no. I said, why? He says, I don't want to know. I don't want anyone to know that I had anything to do with it. I said, okay, fine. I respect that. You've got a lot of atheist friends, whatever. I respect it. I said, let me ask you this, though. You've gone through the argument. I've answered all the weaknesses you said. And you pretty much
helped me answer.
It helped me answer. Yeah, because I would say, what about this? He goes, that's a bad argument. And what about this? Yeah. So you're fine tuning the argument. And I said, so what do you think about this? And he goes, well, it's a good argument. I just don't want to believe in God.
Yeah.
And I said, why? He says, it's not convenient. Because too much would change. And there are atheists who will say that. There's an atheist was arguing with Hugh Ross is a engineer, a rocket scientist. He's a astronomical, cosmological physics guy, right? Cosmologist, and he has a debate with this atheist professor. And he asked the question. Well, the interviewer asked. They're both having the debate. So the moderator, says to Hugh Ross, if tomorrow, if the atheist could prove that God did not exist to you tomorrow, would you would you accept that? And he goes, yeah, if you could prove 100% there was no God, I follow truth, and that's the truth. I have to believe it. So he turns to the atheist. He says, so if Hugh could prove to you that God exists, would you accept it? He goes, I would never accept it. He goes, well, and so then the interviewer goes, and I don't remember the exact conversation, but it went something like this. Says, what if tomorrow you died and you woke up in God's presence and God said, here I am? And the atheist says, I would think I was hallucinating. I said, well, what if God proved to you he wasn't hallucinating? He says, well, I still wouldn't believe in him. I mean, and the guy wasn't a scientist. I think he was a philosopher. So I'll give him the mushiness on his answer, right? But it's got nothing, at some point, God is willing to meet you where you are. But at some point, if you are unwilling to give up your sin because you don't believe that God should have any place in your life, because you don't want the consequences. So in my book, Who's Agent X, I start by saying, don't let the consequences of your logic force you to abandon that logic. So if you get to all this way and say there must be a God, but if there's a God, I have to stop sleeping with my girlfriend. I have to stop going out and getting drunk. I have to stop, whatever that have to stop is. If that consequence is unacceptable to you, then you're abandoning the logic that got you there. So don't let the consequence of the logic force you to abandon the logic, because that's, at the end of the day, that's what a lot of people reject Christ for. And so here's where apologetics is very important. It gets people. So that atheist friend of mine in the cubicle, he got to the point where he said, look, I have to admit it has nothing to do with the evidence. I just don't want God to exist. And if you can get an atheist to that position, he's a far better position than the smoke screen, there's no God because there's not enough evidence. I just gave you all the evidence for God. You don't want to believe in God. Now, I don't say it that way because I don't want to get him angry. He's a friend, and I want to minister him, right? But I want him to understand that it's got nothing to do with what truth is. It has to do with what your desires are, and your desires that there's no God. But you've got to get people to that point.
Yeah.
And so I've had a lot of atheists who have accepted God because they weren't there. They were actually atheists who believed that there wasn't enough evidence for God. So it wasn't. So there are only. It's not everybody who gets there. I mean, I've led. One atheist. It was funny. He was a total hardcore atheist, and his brother was a Christian. And he said, "Oh, you got to go talk to Neil." So we spent weeks, and I walked him through this. The blind faith is bad, and atheists love that because they think blind faith is bad too. Proving God exists without using the Bible. I walked through the Bible is accurate. God, here's why. Proving Jesus rise from the dead. And then I talked about why evil exists. And for like 2-3 weeks, I didn't hear from him. Then one day, and I remember this clearly, I was about to go on stage to preach to some high schoolers on the resurrection. He calls me up. He says, okay, I give up. I'm like, what? He says, I give up. I give up. I'm like, what do you give up? He goes, okay, come over right now and tell me what I need to do to become a Christian. I'm like, dude, you're already a Christian.
Amen. Wow.
And then I said, but I'm about to preach. How about after I'm done, we'll go to dinner together, invite some friends, and I'll lead you in the prayer. But it's only nominal. You are already a believer.
Amen. That's powerful. That's amazing. I love to see it. I love listening to it because you're doing something that is extremely useful to the kingdom. So thank you for what you're doing for the kingdom.
And I want everybody to know this is easy stuff, right? Mm-hmm. If you're interested in science, if you're interested in logic, do apologetics. Yeah. Apologetics is critical. We're commanded to do apologetics, right? Now, what kind of apologetics you do, that's going to be where your interests are. Right.
So they can look you up on
noblindfaith.com.
Noblindfaith.com. They can take a look at all that. Yeah. And they can gain
links to all that.
You can get some materials probably on that.
Materials, and there's so many. Frank Turk's a good friend of mine. He's got excellent stuff, cross-examined. He's got lots of YouTube videos. Josh McDowell, Lee Strobel has stuff out there. There's a lot of resources out there. Just start listening to it in your part-time. You don't have to be super intellectual because a lot of these stuff is, the hard work's already done. Mm-hmm. What a lot of these authors, and that's what I try to do. I try to make it, simplify it for you in an interesting way. You don't have to be a genius. You don't have to. I have a degree in engineering, but there's so many apologists who don't, right? and they do a great job.
Absolutely.
Josh McDowell hasn't ever taken a single physics class probably since he left college, right? Years ago. So, but he's one of the best, one of the great apologists, right?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Neil, I know it's been a long day, so we've been out in the sun all day. So thank you so much for taking the time and joining me in the den. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
I've enjoyed my time getting to know you throughout the day and here as well. So thank you so much.
I appreciate it.
Amen.
Amen.
God bless you.
Thank you.